Hey everyone, thank you for joining the SYSO webinar on ISO New England Show of Interest. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Hey everyone, thank you for joining the SYSO webinar on the ISO New England Show of Interest. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on SYSO's webinar on the ISO New England Show of Interest. Today we're going to be talking through the process that's upcoming in the next few weeks. We're approximately 3 weeks out from the start of the Show of Interest process, which opens on April 17th and runs through April 30th. During today's discussion, we're going to be handing it to Aaron Jenkins, our Senior Sales Engineer from SYSO, as well as Doug Matheson, SYSO Director of Energy Markets, and Dan Curran, CISO Senior Vice President of Energy Markets. My name is Ferdinand Rapant. I'm CISO's Senior Vice President of Business Development. So during today, if we can go to the next slide, we'll be going through a high-level overview of CISO for those of you who are not familiar with CISO. And then Doug Matheson will be walking through ISO New England FCM. They'll be walking through the ISO New England SOI overview. We'll be talking about next steps and then going through a Q&A session at the end. Our Q&A should be open now, so as we're proceeding through the presentation, any questions that you have, just please feel free. If you click along the top panel of your Teams window, you should see a button that says Q&A. Just feel free to enter any questions that you have during the session, and we'll do our best to answer them either during the session or follow up with you individually after our webinar. This will be a recorded session. So just to introduce this series, so today we're going to be focused on ISO New England, SOI, show of interest, and the FCM market. In April, we'll also be talking about PJM, NOI, which is a similar process that's run for the base residual auction in PJM. The timing of the NOI for PJM is June 4th. Projects have to be submitted prior to that date, so we'll have a similar webinar topic in a few weeks that'll focus on PJM. But for today, let's talk about ISO New England. So introducing now Aaron Jenkins, our Senior Sales Engineer, to talk through CISO.
Thank you, Ferdinand. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with everybody today. I see quite a few names that I'm familiar with, along with some new ones. So I will just make a quick introduction of myself. I'm Aaron Jenkins, or AJ. I live in a rural deep south, so I often go by AJ because it's good to have a name that people can spell here. With that said, I've been with CISO for 2.5 years now. I joined CISO just as our first assets were going live and spinning the meter. Prior to CISO, I've spent about 15 or 16 years in a variety of renewable energy positions in locations around the world. I've had the opportunity to work in the wholesale and ancillary energy markets in half dozen countries. Along with myself, we have numerous recognized experts here at CISO, some of whom are on the webinar with us today, and their expertise is open to you and available to you today to assist with your particular projects. Our mission is to be a market leader in renewable energy asset operation and optimization. We all know that the renewable energy space is full of jargon. Sometimes that jargon's becomes so obtuse as to become difficult to decipher. So what does this mean in concrete terms? Next slide, please. Our core competencies are focused on market access and operational excellence. The benefits to you of those are increased profitability and improved outcomes. We utilize our AI-powered forecasting at your individual site, dialed in and focused on the nuances of your particular system, the microclimate affecting it, the day-ahead and real-time prices in the market on a minute-by-minute basis so that we can position your asset for optimal outcomes within that market. Next slide, please. Okay, drilling in down a little bit. Here is an overview of the services that we provide. Firstly, we provide asset registration for your particular facility. This means completion of the necessary forms, lines of credit, and financial assurance to be eligible to be a participant in the wholesale and ancillary energy markets. As an ISO New England market participant, your asset gains access to the markets as a member of our portfolio. Commissioning stage. We also provide secondary commissioning services to ensure that your facility is fit for purpose for the markets in which it is intended. Your EPC has some excellent electrical engineers that know how to dial in the ohm drop across the grounding grid of your facility, but they may not necessarily know what a RIP score is. So if you intend to operate within, say, the frequency regulation market, we will work with you and your EPC to ensure that the responsiveness of your facility meets the requirements of the market for which it's intended. Moving to asset operations, you can rest easily knowing that minute-by-minute monitoring and operations of your asset is being handled by CISO. Our 24/7 NOC is manned around the clock. Our knowledgeable operators are augmented by our proprietary forecasting algorithms that make constant adjustments to the operation of your facility to achieve the best possible outcome. Optimization is achieved by developing solar production forecast models tuned to the size and location and climate of your facility and real-time forecasting of those day-ahead and real-time prices. You can be confident in achieving best possible outcomes with our algorithms. Lastly is reporting and settlement. Excellent management of your asset also comes with excellent reporting. Our operations team compiles quarterly or monthly reports of your asset in clear and easy to read formatting so you know exactly where you are at. In short, SYSO provides IPPs with the ability to operate at the same level of sophistication and efficiency as large investor-owned utilities. Next slide, please. SYSO is a relatively young company. We've been around for about 4 years. Our founders of the company had the infinite wisdom to launch this company during the pandemic. Perhaps a bit inauspicious, but we are growing rapidly and gaining experience and knowledgeability in all of our markets. We have under management now 2 gigawatts, 130 assets across 13 states, and we work within all of the ISOs, all the RTOs within the US. Next slide, please. We're focused on the ISO New England SOI and the forward capacity market at large. So to demonstrate our experience in New England, we are of course based in Boston. The New England market is our backyard, where we grew up and where we have the most spinning assets at the moment. Over the last 3 years, we've cleared more new generating assets in the forward capacity market than any other market participant. Services include our lead market participant, LMP, designated entity DE, again, being those representatives for you in those wholesale and ancillary markets, the real-time telemetry and dispatch infrastructure necessary for operating within those markets, the asset optimization and monitoring around the clock, energy ancillary and capacity participation, as well as state-sponsored programs such as Massachusetts Clean Peak. From here, I'm going to hand the reins to my colleague, Doug Matheson, Director of Energy Markets. I'll give it to you, Doug. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, AJ. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Doug Matheson, Director on our Energy Markets team here at SYSO, calling in from our Boston office. As AJ mentioned, that's where we're headquartered. I specifically cover the Northeast markets for SYSO, so that's New England, New York, and PJM. So today, like I said, I will be getting into the meat of the topic of today's presentation. We'll be talking about how ISO New England's SOI show of interest has changed due to some market reforms at ISO New England. But before I get into that, just wanted to do a brief overview of the capacity market and sort of its timelines and basic mechanics. We've got a lot of attendees on this call, some who may have a deep, level of familiarity with the markets, the capacity market in particular, some who may not. So I could do a whole other webinar, probably a multi-hour, half-day webinar on the capacity market. But for now, just wanted to kind of do a base level to level set everybody so that I can sort of connect the dots more easily, for this change for the show of interest. So ISO New England does have a capacity market. Not all ISOs and RTOs have one, but they have a forward capacity market that rides parallel to day to day, hour to hour, second to second. There's the energy and the ancillary service markets, but in parallel to that, there's a capacity market. And as might be self-evident from the name, it is a forward capacity market. So it's typically held 3 years in advance. It is, ISO New England effectively is doing a load forecast, plus a reserve margin, and saying 3 years into the future, we expect to need these many tens of gigawatts of generation supply online to meet demand. And so they hold that auction 3 years in advance. It's for reliability reasons. Ultimately, it's meant to lead to price formation from the capacity auctions. If prices clear high, then that is to both keep existing resources online and to incentivize new build. Right. Conversely, if pricing clears low, then that's meant to disincentivize new resources, or even potentially to lead to existing resources to retire. But ultimately, when a project participates in one of these capacity auctions, what you're doing is you're securing what's called CSO, a capacity supply obligation. And so that's a commitment to deliver energy or reserves, for a given period sometime in the future. And in return for that, you're going to get a what's called an FCM, for capacity market payment. And again, as I sort of alluded to, this is both for existing and planned new projects. But for the purposes of today's presentation, today's discussion, we're focusing on the show of interest, which is really meant for predominantly new resources. Technically, if you have uprates to existing resources, those qualify too. But predominantly, it's new resources that have never participated in the capacity market before, may already be operational, but generally speaking, planning to come online at some point in the future. So quickly wanted to do a timeline of sort of how this typically works for a given year. So here we just have an example of the most recent one. So the FCA 18 auction was actually held not quite 2 months ago. It was early February. So that was held, and it is, as you can see in kind of the second row there. But if I jump all the way to the bottom, that was for a period 3 years in the future. It's for June 1st, 2027 through May 31st, 2028. It's called either the commitment period or the capacity capability period. But as you can see in that first row, the qualification process starts sooner. So it's actually about this time last year, April 2023, was when the show of interest window started for FCA 18. And that concluded in the fall, and then again, fast forward a few months, we had FCA 18. In addition to the main forward capacity auction, ISO New England also holds reconfiguration auctions. Roughly speaking, there's once every year leading up to the start of the commitment period, and then once you're actually in the commitment period, there's monthly reconfiguration auctions as well. As you can imagine, ISO New England is forecasting 3 years out what their peak load would be. That could evolve over time. Additionally, asset owners, project developers might have an estimate that, like, hey, my project's expected to COD by 6/1/26. So I should be eligible to get in for this timeline. But as we all know, sometimes timelines slip. Sometimes they accelerate. But point being, the reconfiguration auctions are meant to serve a purpose for both ISO New England to sort of true up how much CSO, capacity supply obligation, it procures for the market as a whole, for reliability reasons, and also for individual project owners to right size their position, their capacity commitment relative to their position. So this right here, what I'm talking about now, this is sort of status quo. So this is not yet sort of the new rules. I just wanted to kind of level set everyone, of how this has typically worked. So, this kind of eyesore of a chart of a calendar on the bottom of the screen here, we didn't make this up ourselves. This is straight from ISO New England. It is this complicated. But ultimately, the show of interest is the sort of starting gun to get into a FCM qualification. If you look kind of all the way to the bottom right, you'll see 2/5/2024 forward capacity auction begin date. That was when FCA 18 was held. But if you look kind of almost all the way to the left, there's this sort of a square outline box. That was the show of interest window last year. There's technically some deadlines even before that. Those really apply to existing resources because, as I mentioned, the auction isn't just for new resources, it's existing ones too. But anywhere you see green, kind of like the olive green throughout this calendar, that's part of the process for the qualifying new resources, but ultimately still show of interest is the first one. And again, this is a very complicated process, and it's something that CSYSO does. As AJ mentioned, we are a lead market participant. And you do need to either be a lead market participant or work with one like CSYSO in order to access the capacity market. CSYSO has a kind of wide array of clients. We have some who are asset owners, some who are more pure play developers who who plan to never own an operating asset. And those, they know that they're never going to have to be managing the day-to-day energy and ancillary service market offers for their projects because they're going to sell them at NTP. But sometimes they don't realize that they want to get in the capacity market because they know it's 3 years out. They don't necessarily know that that's the case. So that was just something we wanted to call out here, that you do need to either be one or be working with one who can be a sponsor on your behalf in the process. As I mentioned, SOI is just the starting point. There's a lot of intermediate steps too, but sort of like bare bones minimum kind of baseline requirement to get into that starting gun for SOI. At a minimum, you need to have your interconnection application in at least by the opening of the window. If you've already done that and you already have your system impact study, or if you even already have an executed interconnection agreement, great. But at a minimum, you need to at least have that application in. You also need to have site control. And then this third one here is somewhat unique, but if you don't already have the rights to the capacity rights for the project, then you need to have a plan to acquire them. So a quick example, in Massachusetts, the smart incentive for PV solar, those capacity rights default to the utility, to the host utility. That's just the way that the legislation was written and how it was ultimately implemented. But if you're doing solar plus storage, you have the option to do what's called a capacity buyout, right? So, and again, you don't necessarily need to have exercised that capacity buyout by the show of interest, but you need to have a plan to do so. And ultimately, like I said, it starts in April. There's results in the fall. You get what's called your QDN. Sorry, it's a bit of an alphabet soup. It's your qualification determination notification. That basically gives you what I'm calling provisional or temporary capacity rights. So you get those capacity rights in the fall, and then in the forward capacity auction, you then utilize those to then secure CSO, capacity obligation. So just as an example, let's say you try to qualify a project for 10 megawatts. ISO New England may qualify it for the full amount. They might qualify it for less. Let's say they qualify it for the full 10. You get that in the fall, and then you went into FCA 18 and you offered 10 megawatts and you cleared the full 10. Once you've cleared the full 10 megawatts, not only now do you have your CSO with its FCM payments available, for the 27-28 period, that's sort of a contract. You can think of it as a contracted revenue stream at that point. But you've also established your capacity rights. It was provisionally 10 megawatts, and now it is 10. And so what that then allows you to do in a normal year, and again, I'll get into how things have changed a bit, but in a normal year, you can then use those 10 megawatts of capacity rights in the next year's FCA for 28, 29, 29, 30, right? Wash, rinse, repeat. However, the other thing that you can do, as I sort of mentioned on the previous slide, and I'll go back to it very briefly, there are reconfiguration auctions. So this screen here is showing just the reconfiguration auctions for FCA for the 27-28 commitment period. But let's say your project is expected to COD sometime in 2026, right? There are reconfiguration auctions happening for that FCA, right? For FCA 17, FCA 16, for the big forward capacity auctions that have happened in the past, there are these other reconfiguration auctions. And so to the extent that FCA 18, or what would have been FCA 19, was the first FCA you could have qualified for, because again, that's the gating mechanism to get these capacity rights. You can then use that to go into ARA 1 for 26-27, ARA 2 for 25-26, right? So that's a key thing to keep in mind as I get into the next section of sort of how this has changed, is that in a normal year, and it's been this way for going on 18 years that they've had, that ISO New England has had FCAs. FCA has been the gating mechanism to get capacity rights. So now I'll kind of get into the meat of the presentation. So first, I will talk about, sort of why is this happening? I'll cover the why, and then I'll get into the what. So for about a year now, ISO New England has been working on a market reform that actually a number of different ISOs and RTOs across the US are doing this. It largely has to do with resource accreditation. And I won't get into details. Again, this could be yet another webinar, in its own right, to get into details of what this means and where things stand and the impact and the timing. I will say, though, that ISO New England has planned and continues to plan to first implement this for the 28-29 commitment period. for which FCA 19 would have been the FCA, right? But ISO New England ultimately realized that they needed, and stakeholders too, realized that we needed a bit more time for ISO New England to get it right. And so they went to FERC and they requested a 1-year delay of FCA 19 in order for them to make sure that they did it right. So again, in a normal year, this April 17th would have been the show of interest for FCA 19, and then FCA 19 would have been in February, winter 2025. However, the show of interest on paper is for FCA 19 is now delayed a year to technically the next spring, and then the FCA 19 would not be held until February 2026. I say on paper because ISO New England has also filed plans to delay it a further 2 years for yet another tangentially related, but another potential rule change. It's just not approved by FERC yet. So on paper, it's only 1 year, but it could be up to 3. And I say all this because, as I sort of was getting into on the last slide, normally an FCA is the gating mechanism to get your capacity rights, and then you can go into reconfiguration auctions. But if ISO New England is going to delay FCA 19 by a year, or now potentially up to 3 years, then that could have resulted, were it not addressed, in locking out new projects for 1 to 3 years of the capacity market, right? So these new proposed rule changes are going to go live June 1st, 2028, but that's 4 years from now. So that's potentially up to 4 years and change of capacity revenues that could have been locked out. And so this was something that CSYSO and some of our other peers in the industry noticed when ISO New England was working on filing the request to delay FCA 19 by a year, brought to their attention. They realized it was a gap, and so they ended up creating this this interim process. So that's the what, or sorry, that's the why, and now I'll get into the what. So I think bottom line up front, I think Fred already mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but it's a 2-week window. It opens February 17th, so that's 3 weeks from today, and it closes about 2 weeks later, or April 17th, and it closes 2 weeks after that, April 30th. So it's not a ton of time, but it's also not the 11th hour. That's why we're having this webinar. We have a number of existing clients and some new clients that we've signed up since last year who we're going through this process right now. We've gotten some questions from, again, both existing and prospective clients. So we felt it would be useful to have a webinar that gave enough time to still kind of collect documentation, understand our clients' different project situations, and get everything prepped and ready in time. So I think one of the key things, and I have it right here on the slide, but much of the SOI itself is not changed. Sort of those baseline requirements of you need to at least have your interconnection application in, you need to at least have site control, you need to at least have, where applicable, a plan to acquire rights to the capacity rights, right, for programs like Mass Smart or Maine Community Solar. Those things are not changing. But what I've laid out here are sort of a few key changes that are relevant. So first one is normally, as I used FCA 18 as an example, right, to kind of throughout this presentation, normally you are applying in the show of interest for a specific capability period, capacity capability period. So it's normally going to be June 1st of 1 year through May 31st of the other year. This, because it's for reconfiguration auctions, not an FCA, any project that's expected to COD or has already COD'd, just hasn't gone through SOI before to try to take out a capacity supply obligation, anything in the next 4 years up to June 1st, 2028, that's eligible. Second key thing is that there's this concept, and again, sorry, apologizing, the alphabet soup that some of these ISO use, but there's this term called NCCFA, non-commercial capacity financial assurance. This is something that ISO New England uses. Essentially, it's a bit of a carrot and a stick approach. So the carrot is you clear in the FCA and you get capacity supply obligation, and that comes with a contracted revenue stream, right? The stick is that if you're not yet operational, not yet commercial, they want to make sure that you are online by the start of that capability period. And so they do that by requiring upfront. It varies year to year, but it's roughly $8,000 a megawatt. But then it actually increments. So it's 8,000 out of the gate. After 1 year, it's going to be a 2x multiplier, so 16,000. After 2 years, 3x. After 3 years, 4x. So again, they do this to incentivize projects to be online and on time, and ideally as soon as possible. So again, that's normal process. For this interim process, there is no FA. So the forward capacity auctions up through June 1st, 2028, those have already been held. And so there are projects that have this financial assurance requirement, but everything that's coming online in the next 4 years that would participate in a reconfiguration auction, there's no financial assurance requirement. And so the cost is lower to participate. Next thing I want to mention is, and I'm going to use the technical term is CNRC, which is capacity network resource capability. And then there's the distinction of what's state jurisdictional and FERC jurisdictional. I'm just going to use the shorthand, which is DG scale versus transmission scale for state versus FERC, and then capacity rights for CNRC. So for DG scale projects, again, historically, the way to get those capacity rights, I've said it a few times now, is you qualify for an FCA, you go into the FCA, you clear, you secure your CSO, and now you have that CSO, those capacity rights rather, in all future auctions, whether they're FCAs or reconfiguration auctions. With this interim process, because the FCA 19 is delayed, they changed the rules to say you can now, for DG projects, you can secure by securing CSO and a reconfiguration auction over the next 4 years, that will establish your capacity rights. So that's DG, pretty straightforward. Transmission scale can get a bit more complicated. Status quo, the normal process is the same or was the same for DG. However, in parallel to ISO New England and the stakeholders sort of their own volition working on this capacity accreditation rule change that precipitated the FCA 19 delay, there was something that FERC ordered last summer. It's called Order 2023. And again, we'll not go into the details, not go in the weeds, because again, I think this is the third or fourth time I've said this, but this could be another webinar in its own right with the level of complexity. Suffice to say, and I'll also add that there's some additional like hot off the press, late breaking news. Last week, FERC actually granted a request for rehearing and clarification, and they issued Order 2023A. And so that has already, that's added a little bit of a additional uncertainty to what the timeline and what the requirements would be for transmission scale projects. That said, I will still say, the show of interest window itself is not changing. That is still April 17th to April 30th. And transmission scale projects, generally speaking, if you're developing a late stage project, or if you're a recent buyer of a project that's considered late stage and construction is beginning soon, you may be eligible. Earlier stage, likely not. But again, some of this late breaking news from last week, some of these deadlines, for example, having a completed system impact study by April 30th, that may be pushed out a few more months. And so the eligibility window for transmission scale projects may be expanded. So that's all to say, and there's a lot more detail to it, but that's all to say that, if you have a DG project, reach out to us because you're eligible, assuming your COD is before 6/1/28. Same for transmission scale, but transmission scale can be, each one can somewhat be their own snowflake. So definitely reach out to us, and we can, give our opinion on whether we think it's worth it for this go around. Lastly, last thing I'll mention here before I turn it back over to Fred is that you might be asking, all right, this is only 3 weeks away. Maybe I don't have my act together. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm eligible. Again, I'd say first things first, if you're not sure you're eligible, definitely, whether it's DG or transmission scale, reach out to us. Again, whether you're not a client of ours yet, or whether you're an existing client where you might have some projects with us, but you're working on some new projects that you haven't brought to our attention yet, let us know and we'll look into it. But if you're concerned that maybe we can't get this together, pull it all together in the next 3 weeks, we can. We've done this. This is the third, if not fourth year SYSO's done this for our clients, and we have some who do come to us late. But what I'm trying to communicate on this slide is that it's better to get in sooner rather than later. So like if you're eligible now, but you wait until next spring, assuming that ISO New England does create another interim SOI for spring 25, because FCA 19 might be delayed another 2 years. That is possible, but generally speaking, pricing will be lower. There's almost sort of a pricing or a risk premium the further out you are from the start of a given capability period, a given delivery period. And so the sooner you can get qualified, the sooner you can access the earlier, ARA 1 versus ARA 2, ARA 2 versus ARA 3. Generally speaking, you're gonna end up securing higher revenue. So I'll leave it there, and I will turn it back over to Fred for next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So CISO is looking forward to supporting your SOI, right? And to discussing your project and project goals. If you're an existing client of ours where your asset is already under contract with CISO and it's all set for the SOI this year and that's confirmed, there's no action required on your end. We've got it. However, for those of you who don't have your SOI confirmed with CISO, recommend you reaching out to us in a few different ways. So number one, you could just simply reply to the email that covered this webinar, information@syso.com. So that's one way to request support. Dan Curran's just put a JOT form, which we call our site intake form, into the meeting chat. If you haven't confirmed that you have CISO support for your project's SOI in April, if you could just load that JOT form sooner rather than later, our site intake form, we'll use that information and be in touch with you directly. The third way, obviously, is more obvious, right? Just reach out to your CISO representative. If you're currently working with a business development manager on my team or a client services manager on Jim Petrus's team, please feel free to just reach out to your CISO contact and highlight that you do need support. So those are three really simple ways. The SOI does open 3 weeks from today. So the sooner that we receive your data, the better our response will be. This isn't something that we want to leave until the last minute. CISO is going to be pretty well locked down in our SOI process starting on the 17th of April. So we'd really want your information well in advance of that, even this week. So there's just 3 ways to request CISO's support. I think at this point in the agenda, we want to probably hand it over to questions and answers. So our Senior Vice President of Energy Markets, Dan Curran, is on to talk through questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Ferdinand. So thanks, everyone. As Ferdinand was just mentioning, I lead the energy markets team here at SYSO, so I work very closely with Doug. So we've got some questions that have come in. We've got some questions that have come in previously from clients. So that was a lot of information that Doug just went through in a very short period of time. So if you have questions at the top of the webinar, you'll see there's both a chat and a Q&A button. Please go to the Q&A button and drop them in. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can if we have time. We'll certainly be mindful of the clock. If some of the questions are more site specific, we might just follow up with you directly afterwards. But with that, Doug, we've got a long list of questions here, so let me dive in. First off, question, will participating in the SOI qualify me for FCA 19?
It may and it may not. So if you are able to, so if you request to be qualified for, let's say, 10 megawatts through this interim process, but you only get qualified for 5, any amount less than 10, then again, that will establish, and you can secure CSO in a reconfiguration auction. That will establish your CNRC, your capacity rates, and so you will be all set for 5 megawatts. So when FCA 19 rolls around, as I mentioned, these forward capacity auctions are both for existing and planned. 5 megawatts of your project would be considered existing, but then we would have to do another SOI for the remaining 5 megawatts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Doug. Next, if my project participated in FCA 18, does it need to be enrolled in the SOI this spring?
question. And that's effectively the other side of the coin of what I just answered. So if you cleared in full for FCA 18, then no, you don't need to go through this process because you're now considered existing, right? But if you didn't, if you went through the qualification process for FCA 18, if you either withdrew, there's certain instances where ISO New England can deem you administratively withdrawn, or if you made it all the way to the auction but didn't clear in the auction, either in full or in part, then again, you haven't yet established your CNRC or capacity rights. And so you'd want to go through SOI, again, whether it be the full amount or any residual amount that wasn't cleared.
Okay, great. What happens if I don't participate in SOI this spring? Will I have another chance?
Yep. Well, the answer is currently no, but most likely yes. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, on paper, there's only a 1-year delay to FCA 19. ISO New England, though, has requested it be delayed for another 2 years, which is so 3 years in total. If that's approved, then in all likelihood, they would be creating another interim SOI for spring 25 and again in spring 26. So if you don't get in now, there is a decent chance, although it's not a sure thing, because again, it's not approved by FERC yet, that you could get in, next year. But as I mentioned, pricing tends to be higher in the earlier reconfiguration auctions, and so to the extent that you are eligible now and can send us your information, in the next couple of weeks, and as Fred mentioned, ideally, sooner rather than later, then we would want to try to get you into this SOI so that you don't miss out on that premium by waiting a year.
Okay, great. Can you elaborate on why projects in Massachusetts have to buy their capacity rights?
Yep, and it's not, I might have misspoke, it's not all projects. So there's specifically for solar, so there's the SMART program in Massachusetts, and the way that the legislation was created and then it was ultimately implemented as a way to reduce the surcharges that ratepayers pay. Energy market revenues flow to, or I should say, all wholesale market revenues by default flow back to the host utility so that they don't have to charge ratepayers as much, and that includes capacity rights. However, to the extent you're developing a PV plus storage project, you for the battery component, you can elect what's called a capacity buyout option, where there's a formula that Mass DOER has created that you can calculate what it costs. I think it's been close to $0, if not zero, the past couple of years. Yeah, you elect the buyout, and then you have the capacity rights. And again, just a reminder, you don't have to, if you are building a PV plus storage smart project in Massachusetts, you don't need to have exercised that buyout by SOI. You just need to have a plan to do it by SOI. There's an attestation that has to be made as one of the documents saying that if you don't already have them, you plan to acquire them.
Okay, great. What happens if my project gets delayed?
There's never delays in renewable storage and renewable energy and storage development. Yeah, so as we know, delays happen. The short answer is that, and this is largely unchanged from how it works with FCAs too, with a key caveat. Those reconfiguration auctions, whether they're annual or monthly, you have the ability, if you cleared 5 megawatts in FCA 18, or if you clear 5 megawatts in any of the reconfiguration auctions that are unlocked by going through this interim SOI project, you can then subsequently go into another reconfiguration auction to buy out or to shed that CSO. And so that's status quo rules. I'd say the one key difference is, because there's no FA, there's no financial assurance tied to the reconfiguration auctions. It's sort of, you can kind of walk away without any long-term risk. Whereas when you clear CSO in an FCA, normally there is that financial assurance that's out there that ISO New England is effectively requiring you to have that project built, or you would forfeit the FA. But again, there's no FA in play here. So it's really just a matter of, we would go into the first reconfiguration auction where it makes sense. Let's say you have a 6/1/26 projected COD. We'd go into the reconfiguration auction, take out CSO, but then let's say that's delayed a year to 6/1/27. All right, well, now we would go into the next annual or even potentially the monthlies to just buy out of that. So it's, as I joked at the beginning, like it is fairly common that projects see delays. And so this is something that, we help our clients with pretty regularly.
Okay, great. Next question, is there a cost to participating in the SOI?
Yep, good question. So yeah, I was just talking about financial assurance. So there is no financial assurance. So that part is a no. ISO New England does require another deposit. And again, this is alphabet soup. So I'm going to throw another one at you, at the attendees. It's called QPCRD. See if I can remember this one. Qualification Process Cost Reimbursement Deposit. I think that's right. It varies, but it's, for most DG scale projects, I believe it's about, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's about $6,500, $7,500 per project. For transmission scale, I think it's closer to 20,000. Don't quote me on that, but it's a flat fee, and it's effectively used to create a balance with ISO New England that they effectively treat as a billable hours of sorts, where they do their deliverability studies. For some of our clients' projects, they use a very small amount of that because it's on a not congested part of the distribution or transmission system, doesn't require a ton of analysis, and so the unused balance of that gets returned. And then for some other projects, though, there's a lot of studies that they have to do. It could be on a constrained area, and so they might use up all of that balance. They might come back asking for a true up, right? Because again, think of it as sort of like billable hours for ISO staff. But on average, they don't use too much. On average, we haven't seen them use more than half of the deposit over the past several years. So that's the main cost. So in addition to our fees, of course, but it's from ISO New England's perspective, it's really there's that QPCRD, and that's typically due. I think it would likely be due sometime in June. So after the SOI concludes, that's when ISO New England would invoice us.
Okay, great. Next, if I submit into the SOI, can I cancel my request?
Yes. So up to a certain point. So it's in late October. I think it's October 24th. Don't quote me on that. But that is the deadline to withdraw from the qualification process. And again, that is largely unchanged from previous years, where you can submit your show of interest on April 17th, and then we could withdraw it on April 18th before the window's closed. We could withdraw it at any point over the summer. I would say though that is a one-time irrevocable decision, right? So if you're not sure that it should be withdrawn, it's better to have a conversation. And again, the latest that it can be done is sometime in late October. So you can back out. After that point, you are going to be qualified, or you're going to be there. ISO New England is going to finish the qualification review process. But whereas in past years with FCAs, like I've said, there's financial assurance. Normally that deadline is because if you want to pull out, then you don't have to post FA within a few weeks. If you stay in, you do have to post the FA. So again, given that there's no financial assurance required for these for the reconfiguration auctions that would result from participating in this interim SOI, that's a bit of a looser deadline, I guess, is my kind of layman's way to explain it. But the short answer is yes, you can always pull out up until that deadline.
Okay, great. If my project is part of a cluster study, can it participate in the SOI?
Okay, yeah, so this is getting into some of the transmission scale. So as I sort of alluded to, and again, this could be sort of its own webinar in and of itself, FERC Order 2023, what that required ISOs and RTOs to do throughout the US is the main goal was to expedite interconnection for projects that are under its jurisdiction, which again, generally speaking, shorthand or transmission scale and higher. Most ISOs have had a serial interconnection process, for first come, first serve. ISO New England's been a bit unique where it's been first cleared, first served, right? That's the whole, what I was talking about earlier in the presentation. You get your CSO, you get your capacity rights, you can use that going forward. FERC required ISOs and RTOs to move to a first ready, first served. And so how that's largely being implemented are with cluster studies where there will be a window or two per year where everyone who's ready can get in, and they're all sort of treated as a serial queue, as an equal queue position, as if they had been in the serial queue. That process going forward will look very different. So projects that are early stage or don't even yet, transmission scale projects that are early stage or don't even have their interconnection application in yet, you will likely be slotted into the first real cluster study. And how ISO New England has proposed how capacity rights will work there is it's now part of the interconnection process. And so you will be studied throughout the cluster study process, get your capacity rights there, and then you can use that in the auctions. However, there's this transition mechanism, again, where some of the dates are TBD. It's April 30th right now for system impact study, but that may be pushed out a bit longer. And there's also some transitional group studies. Those are the projects that it makes sense to go through the interim SOI. If you're likely in a cluster study, this probably is too early. That said, what I would add is just given how complex some of the transmission scale FERC jurisdictional projects eligibility can be, and again, given some of this late breaking news last week with FERC Order 2023A, I would just encourage whoever asked that question just to reach out to SYSO and we can take a look, fill out the intake form. We can take a look at your project specifics and weigh in one way or the other.
Okay, great. Next question, Doug, on financial assurance. How is FA calculated and is this paid annually?
So the NCCFA non-commercial capacity financial assurance, it is calculated by ISO New England. It's based on this concept called net CONE, net cost of new entry. And it is something that, again, in a normal year, you would go through show of interest in the spring, you get your qualification, your qualified megawatts in the fall. You then, again, you have a deadline of saying, am I staying in or am I exiting, withdrawing from the process? If you stay in, then within a week or two later of that deadline, normally that's when the initial deposit would be due. And I believe that's $2,000 per megawatt. And then right before the opening of the auction itself, a week or so before of the FCA, the balance is due up to that net CONE amount. And it varies year to year, but that's the roughly $8,000 per megawatt amount. And that's what it'll be before the auction. That's what it'll be after the auction for a year. But for whatever CSO you cleared, again, there's multipliers. So it'll start with a 1x multiplier, recognizing that you may not have all of the details yet for your project. And so the stick of the carrot and stick doesn't need to be that strong. But after a year, that'll go up to 2x. After 2 years, it goes up to 3x. After 3 years, you're now approaching the start of the relevant commitment period. And then it actually starts to accelerate. So it goes up to 4x in July, 5x December, and it'll kind of keep doing that for a bit. I mean, ultimately, if a project is never going to get built, and again, this is sort of normal years, just for context, none of this applies to the interim SOI because it's reconfiguration auctions only. But if a project is never going to get built, ultimately at some point, a decision has to be made. Do we want to terminate the CSO? And at that point, any NCCFA that's out there is forfeit to ISO New England. And so again, that's the stick. So it's ISO New England is essentially trying to incentivize, come online as soon as you can, or tell us as soon as you can if this project's not actually going to get built, right? But again, that's all for FCA in normal years. That does not apply to the reconfiguration auctions. There's no NCC financial assurance requirement.
Okay, Great. So Doug, you had mentioned at the start of the call that you cover the Northeast, including PJM. So we've got a question that's sort of right up your alley. Question, the discussion centered around ISO New England markets and auctions. How does this compare to the PJM, to capacity rights and the PJM auction process?
Yep, it's a good question. So my background is in PJM. Prior to SYSO, I worked at an LX, formerly Enernoc, for a bit, and I exclusively worked on PJM. I would say that given my kind of depth of exposure to both, they're very similar. PJM and New England have both had forward capacity auctions. It's called the FCM, forward capacity market in ISO New England, and then it's the forward capacity auction. PJM calls it the BRA, the base residual auction. They've sort of diverged in paths, but over the past several years, but they're starting to kind of converge back. ISO New England has been kind of steady as she goes the past several years with respect to sort of honoring the timeline that's out there for the FCM. And it wasn't until this change with capacity accreditation that they opted for a delay of 1 year, and now looks like 3. PJM has had a number of delays of their own, going kind of all the way back to the 2014 polar vortex. It was further exacerbated by Winter Storm Elliott, December 2022. Lots of rule changes, but PJM has an analogous process to the show of interest. I think Fred mentioned this earlier. It also has a very similar acronym. It's called NOI, Notice of Intent. And that's similarly the starting gun to getting into PJM's version of the capacity market. PJM has different rules about, I was kind of distinguishing for ISO New England between DG projects, state jurisdictional, and transmission scale projects, FERC jurisdictional. That concept still exists in PJM, but PJM has a unique element where they won't really accept just a utility interconnection. If you're interconnecting on a distribution line, you need what they call a WMPA, WMPA, Wholesale Market Participant Agreement. That's for state jurisdictional projects. So there's differences between them. I always liken them to sort of Romance languages. One's French, one's Spanish, right? You just kind of have to learn the lingo. But what I would say is, I think as Fred mentioned, we're planning to host another webinar about that PJM NOI sometime in the near future. And so we will, cover sort of a similar, BRA 101 overview for that, and we'll kind of get into the details on the NOI. I would say PJM doesn't require as much documentation as ISO New England does, so it's less paperwork. So that's nice. But it similarly has NOI as the starting gun, and then there's a number of intermediate pre-auction steps leading up to the auction. Last thing I'll say is PJM already has delayed their big auction. So whereas normally it's every 3 years, like an FCA has been in New England for years, PJM is already on a condensed timeline. So this June, they're having the NOI for a December BRA for 26-27, but at the same time, roughly the same time this June, they're also having the BRA for 25-26. So what was supposed to be a 3-year forward market is now just under a 1-year forward market, just given some of the delays they've run into.
Okay, great. So I want to just come in, I think very relevant to a lot of folks. How do I determine if my project is state versus FERC jurisdictional?
Yep, so that is a good question. I would say that it is easier to tell that there are sort of clear, bright line differences for FERC jurisdictional. I'd say right out of the gate, if you have your interconnection application documentation, if it's either an SGIA or an LGIA, small and large generator interconnection applications or agreements, that by definition is FERC jurisdictional. But I would say that generally speaking, the sort of like rules of thumb is if you're over 20 megawatts, you're going to be FERC jurisdictional. If you are on, I believe it's a 69 kV line or higher, that's considered, don't quote me on that, that's considered the transmission system, so that's FERC jurisdictional. And if you're not those things, then you're likely distribution interconnection, you're likely FERC state jurisdictional. But that's not always the case, because even if you're on a distribution line, if you're over 20 megawatts, again, now you're FERC jurisdictional. And there's been some, you still have the option, I would say, to be FERC jurisdictional, but most of our clients, if they're eligible, they'll only do the utility interconnection process, whether it be Eversource or CMP or Unitil or whomever, right? They'll just go through that process and not want to get bogged down, in the ISO queue. But at the end of the day, again, I kind of say this sort of a catch-all answer. If you're not sure, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Okay, so Doug, I think we might have time for just one more question. I want to make sure we're able to wrap up and kind of end this on time. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. I didn't think I'd do this, but question here. What's the likelihood that FERC will approve the additional 2-year delay on FCA 19?
I would put it at over 95% if I had to sort of read the tea leaves. The reason being, in addition, ISO New England needed the 1-year delay. They basically found a bit of a design flaw with some of the capacity accreditation modeling that they were doing, so they needed a delay because, again, they wanted to implement it in time for FCA 19, so they needed to delay that. The impetus to delay it an additional 2 years is a separate market reform where ISO New England is considering moving away from a forward capacity auction paradigm and moving to what's typically called a prompt auction structure. So if you're familiar with New York ISO or MISO, they have prompt auctions where it's held typically no more than, typically a few months, no more than 6 months in advance of the start of a capability period. So there is a chance that, FCA 18 was the last forward auction, right? And so it is very likely that there will be this interim SOI. There will be 2 more interim SOIs, and then ISO New England and the NEPOL stakeholders will likely, it's not a sure thing. I'll put it 95% hedging. I can never put 100%. But just the way things have been going with the market monitor and some outside third-party expert consultants that ISO New England hired, they see net benefits moving to a prompt auction. So my guess is 6/1/2028 will be the start of some. It won't be called a forward capacity market. It'll probably be called something different. But it will be a more like a New York, strip auction or monthly or spot auctions. And so yes. So long story short, I would put it very high certainty that that additional 2 years. 3 years total will go through, so that ISO New England has additional time, not just for capacity accreditation, but also to finalize, to think about and then finalize how to move from a forward to a prompt auction structure.
Right. Well, Doug, thanks very much. So we're right at the end of our allotted time. I want to make sure we wrap up on time for everyone. So there were more questions that we didn't get to. Appreciate everyone that put these questions in. This was a fantastic set of questions. If we weren't able to get your question, please reach out to us. As Doug and Ferdinand were saying, SOI begins 3 weeks from today. So as Doug said, it's not too late, but there's not much time. So if you are interested in talking to SYSO about working with your project, getting it enrolled in the SOI, please reach out. You can reach out to your sales or client services rep if you already have one. If not, the information at SYSO email we have here and the project site form that I put in the meeting chat. So thanks to our speakers. Thanks to Doug and Aaron. Really appreciate them covering this material. Thanks to all of you for joining today. And we look forward to talking with you and working with you going forward. Thanks, everyone. Take care.